Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly ship show. My name is Jason Brand. I am catching my breathing in there. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And if you haven't heard of us before, we are a full service logistics provider. And we've got something we like to call an integrated logistics solution. And that is essentially taking all of our departmental groups, merging them all together under the above the data platforms we've built out, right? The ways we handle your documents just to make sure customs is done properly, our transportation management tools, domestic, internationally, our inventory management tools, and we stitch all of that together to be able to create this integrated solution. It's what we believe the future of transportation looks like, and honestly, it works fantastically for our customers. So make sure you reach out to us to learn more. Some of our customers are using us on different capacities, and they've been kind of upgrading to this new way of operating, and it's been doing a pretty good job. It's been pretty cool to see that improvement across operations. So give us a call. You can always give me a call. You can obviously reach out to Vanessa, Dax, or just shoot me a LinkedIn message, and we will point you in the right direction to learn more. So thanks so much for joining us today. Now, we have our Freight Market Roundup. And if you joined us on last week's show, you know we covered a lot about sustainability, which, spoiler alert, we did it because it was Earth Day last week. And quite frankly, there is so much going on. It was a critical show for us to cover. And it's affecting you guys as well. So make sure if you haven't seen that episode, you go back and check it out. I'm actually going to do a continuation of sustainability here for the beginning, simply because there's a couple initiatives that started literally in the past 10 days. They will affect you. They will affect your costs. They will affect how you ship. So we've got to talk about them. Our teams are talking about them. A couple of our clients are talking about them. So we got to put it out there to you. So before we dive into our regular Freight Market Roundup, let's talk about these things. First of all, U.S. Department of Transportation Federal Highway Administration last week, they announced an $148 million federal fund grant, and it's going to be going to a total of 16 projects. That's going on across 11 states, and that's also including Puerto Rico. Now, this grant money is required to be used specifically to reduce pollution. So that means it's going to be focused, actually, that does not mean this, but this was stated. It's going to be focused on trucks either going electric or using alternative fuels, or at a minimum, upgrading existing diesel engines. Now, out of that 148 million, based on what we've seen, Long Beach is getting the most. They're getting just shy of 35 million. They're going to be using that money to replace 149 diesel and gas-powered trucks. Also, they're going to be installing 155 charging stations as well. And really, you do the math on that. I was pretty surprised how much you could actually purchase for 34.9.8 million. I didn't think you'd be able to get that many trucks, quite frankly, but sure enough, you can. So that's one project. And remember, that's happening across a bunch of different places. Long Beach just got the biggest chunk of that change. Now, there's another project, same 10 days that happened. Biden announced a plan. It is providing it's providing 1.5 billion. And the plan that was announced was a goal of increasing the use of zero emission vehicles to transport freight. And it's part of a goal to improve air quality. One issue that was actually cited, which is a great issue, and you actually forget about it, is the air quality at the ports is terrible, simply because you have all of these trucks idling for hours and hours and hours. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of trucks coming in and out, but it's a pollution hotspot. So this bill is going to mainly fund the EPA to make some changes. Now, there is a section that's not... I don't want to go into the details on this too much because it's got some complexities to it. But let me just talk about the EPA portion that's not involving the pollution at the ports. They are getting $1 billion, and this is going to be focused on cities and states replacing Class 6 and Class 7 vehicles. So that means we're talking about Class 6. Think of straight trucks. Think of single axle. Think of kind of those stub nose vehicles. School buses, when I talk about straight truck, you've got your locked truck, doesn't pivot. And those tend to be Class 6. They tend to be. Notice I said tend to be. Now, also, we've got Class 7s they're focusing on. That is a category that a lot of city service vehicles tend to be in. You've got your transit buses, you've got your garbage trucks, you've got your street sweepers. Now, some of these vehicles can get even too large for that class, but generally speaking, Class 7 contains most of those nicely. So they want to focus on Class 6 and Class 7 at city and state level with the $1 billion of the $1.5 billion that is going through the EPA. So that is happening. Last 10 days, that was announced as well. The timeline on that is a little bit blurry, which I think with some of these huge initiatives, you kind of can see that. You either see a timeline that's like, in 2030, we're going to be doing this. And at 2028, they're like, in 2035. But these, and I just, obviously sarcasm, but there is a little bit of an opposite of that trend actually happening. We noticed the 2030, the 2050 targets. You still hear those and see those, but some of those are actually creeping lower. We've got a 2027 target that just came out. There's a 2025 target that just came out. So some of these are really picking up steam. I don't have an idea of the target of the $1.5 billion plan, and it's an election year. So what is the strength of this plan to withstand, right, an election? So we will more to find out on that as the year comes. And we're going to have to keep covering this because there's just a lot happening here. So also, if you did not watch the last episode, the WSC, I'm not even going to get into it. Upload it. Go to Spotify. Look up The Ship Show. Look up the Freight Market Roundup. Look for me. Look for Anthony. And it's on Spotify. It's on Apple. It's wherever you get your podcasts. And load that thing up. It's 15 minutes. You can hear it in your car ride. I'll run through all the stuff going on. There is a lot happening in the next few years in the ocean realm. That was mainly focused on the ocean realm. Obviously, these are focused more homestead on the ground vehicles. Apologies. We got a lot of pollen out there right now. I had that day where my car was covered. And I was like, oh no, here it comes. Anyway, let's get back to our normal Freight Market Roundup. So our goal here on the show for the Freight Market Roundup, we're going to run through some rates for you. We're going to tell you what our customers are paying right now. We're going to talk about overarching trends, a couple bits of current events that are affecting our customers or will affect our customers or are changing how we're doing our planning. Now, today it's going to be slightly different. I'm just going to run through the rates because obviously we did this slightly differently already. So let's start off with our Trans-Pacific. It's the lane we generally like to start with. You've got Southeast Asia, China, neighboring regions shipping into the U.S. West Coast. That's what we're going to focus on first. So this lane we've talked about has had some it's been pretty impressive actually over the course of the beginning of this year. It's seen a lot more volume, a lot more imports, and it hasn't spiked in the way that it could have. It did increase in price, but it didn't spike in the way it could have. And obviously, we've seen it in the past prior to the pandemic when there's a new surge of imports. Actually, lately, other than the past couple weeks, it's been relatively flat, higher, but flat. Now, past couple weeks, we've seen that kind of change. So what's interesting is our spread has remained about the same, 2,800 through 4,000. That's kind of what we're seeing between all origins and destinations. And but what did change is our average. Our average went up to 3,500. And that just means that, while maybe the most expensive shipping costs aren't increasing quite yet, the average shipping cost obviously is. So 3,500, it's definitely up, and it's going to be a lot higher next week because we did have a GRI just come through on May 1st, and it was a $1,000 GRI. We're also in a little bit of a situation here because it is right before contract season. So any volume going through these lanes right before contract season is like great for the ocean liners. So the question is, will that GRI stick? And if it does stick, how will it affect your contracts? But we'll get a little bit into more into that in a minute. Let's switch over. So we were just talking about Trans-Pacific. Let's switch over to Transatlantic. We're talking about your European origins coming into the U.S. East Coast. And, what we actually did notice is the opposite in this lane. We did notice in about that same period, we saw a dip, not nearly as steep of a dip as we saw with, or not inversely equivalent, if that makes sense, but a dip that was noticeable. So what we've noticed in the past month plus of this lane is just a really slow and steady degradation of the cost. But last week, we noticed a dip of roughly $150 down per 40-foot container. And, during the pandemic times, $150 down off of your $14,000 container was nothing. But in normal times, that's a pretty decent change for a week-to-week basis, especially given contract season. So $150 down is what we saw. It brought our averages for the lane to 1900, which is making it the most reasonable shipping lane in the world right now. It is a shorter shipping lane. It generally has a decent number of lanes, so it's not as, it hasn't been, this is all caveats after the pandemic, but it hasn't been as price sensitive, which has been, beneficial for shippers, but yes. So let's move on. Let's talk about air freight. Air freight. What we are seeing from all of our Southeast Asia and China destinations into all of our Southeast Asia and China origins, and to our U.S. destinations is an average of around $6.41 a kilo. Ouch. And right now, the cheapest is LAX, and the most expensive is ATL. LAX was coming in at $5.95 a kilo, and ATL coming in at $6.70 a kilo. Now, these rates are actually down from last week, but they are still very elevated compared to year-over-year rates. Now, we did also talk about this in a previous show, kind of what is going on. There's a little bit of an imbalance, and I can talk about this a little bit here with some new information. So April, it was the fourth month in a row that global air cargo demand increased by over 11%. And the market is actually starting to show signs that it's slowing down right now, which hopefully that will stabilize these high freight rates. But, there's a lot of factors here. I mean, you're going to have to go back and watch that show. I kind of go into a couple of the companies, Temu and Shein, for example. They exclusively ship air. They soak up like 60 tons of air freighter space on a weekly basis, and they've just been growing. And we just don't have a lot of air freighters. Let's put it that way. So, it's a problem that is growing. Don't want to spoil that show. Anyway, let's continue. So, let's talk about ocean shipping. When it comes to ocean shipping, right, we mentioned that spike that was happening in the Trans-Pacific lanes coming out of Southeast Asia and China. And I mentioned that, I mentioned that was happening. There was obviously the increase in imports that we've been seeing over the course of the year. But that recent bump seems to be an even further increase in purchase orders happening at Chinese or neighboring factories. And that happened throughout April. So, from information from the National Retail Federation, the consensus is a lot of retailers are burning through, or they've burnt through, their overhanging or just oversupplied inventory at U.S. warehouses, and they're doing their first normal restocking season right now. And I really want to say normal with the quotations because, quite frankly, it is not normal by any means from a volume standpoint yet. But this is definitely a great step in that normalization, that right direction. And it's as the pendulum swings, right, with the pandemic, you get overheated and then you had the bad afterwards. We obviously have the ripple effect in the years after. So it's good to see a restocking season come back. If we have a great peak season this year, the great news about this mini restocking season, which is still having an effect, is that we'll probably see a very healthy restocking season next year, which should sign that, that pendulum is starting to steady and we'll be back to a more stabilized market. So very, very good. But that's likely why we're seeing this increase. Obviously, timing with the contract season, not great. But, just kind of consider your expectations, consider your budgets, consider what you're seeing based on when you get into those contract talks. And that's a whole nother discussion as well. Anyway, we do have to talk about the East Coast, and I've got one more thing I want to touch on before we go. So East Coast, the ILA, remember them. That's the Longshoremen's Union on the East Coast. It is they've been going through their contract negotiations. They've got a high likelihood of going into a strike. And it quite frankly is historic in nature, and it's building itself up to be historic in the way it happens. So I hate to say that, right? We just went through a lot of contract negotiations. The West Coast, obviously, we had Canada, we had Hawaii, we had U.S. Rail, we had the Teamsters. I mean, it's obviously contract negotiations. They happen and they happen again. They just, that's the way it happens, right? In a year from now, we'll be talking about another contract negotiation. But given everything that happened during the market, given the inflation that happened and everything associated with the pandemic. All of these have been really painful contract negotiations. And this one is really going to be, unfortunately, it's going to be bad. So unlike what happened during the West Coast contract negotiations, back in November of last year, the ILA's president, his name is Harold Daggett, he essentially announced that the ILA would not work beyond contract expiration. If a contract was not met by the expiration, they would stop working. Now, if you want to compare that to what happened with the ILWU's contract ran up, I believe, on the end of June, and they worked through fall, through winter, and didn't reach an agreement till like early spring of the following year. So that was painful. And they were so friendly when they said we're good, and they didn't even sign an extension. They were just contractless, and then it just got ugly. But from everything we're seeing, any ugliness that happened on the ILWU, let's kind of use our same reference points, our Pacific side, it's going to be nothing compared to what's happening or what's stewing with the ILA. There's a really solid reason from this. So Mr. Daggett announced that he announced a few pretty aggressive things, to say the least, but he basically says that they're entitled to a fair share of that $400 billion in total industry profits that came out of the pandemic. And in his words, he aims to achieve the greatest master contract in our union's history. And he's expecting the carriers to deliver on this landmark compensation package. And there's a problem here because we're not in the pandemic anymore and the carriers are not cash rich anymore. The timing is just not ripe at the moment. Unfortunately, last year, when I hear that, it's funny because we saw a huge profit erosion across the board. I mean, logistics company, we just saw obviously volume dry up, and there was an 88% drop in profits last year, and a lot of ocean carriers found themselves in the red. Now, this is not conveying any opinion I have defending the ocean carriers. Let me make that very, very, very clear. But the timing of the ILA's contract negotiation, unfortunately, just is not lining up. So I don't see how they can get anywhere near that. And as we talked about in the past few weeks, these companies are investing heavily in more expensive ships. And now there's all of the new decarbonization initiatives and the new, the new CE index, the ship rating guide, the new taxes and fines associated. It's a pricey environment out there, and that $400 billion is unfortunately pretty much long gone. So, but we'll see. We will see. If anything, I would recommend maybe considering the West Coast. I think that's a pretty reasonable guess. Anyways, let's move on. We really got to watch that one. It's been aggressive, and there's actually a couple other more aggressive things that have happened. So just to kind of go on with this, the ILA was noticing a little bit of a stalling out of their contract negotiations back in February of this year. So they actually set a May 17th deadline for some of the lower level talks to be completed. So it's really heating up actually right now. And their contract negotiation is due by September 30th. And back in November, Mr. Daggett said they would strike on the 30th or beyond, right after, if there was no contract reached. So this is definitely, your risk of happening. They've been making it very clear they will. They've been getting everybody in the mindset of they will. And they've been trying to set a cadence to getting these negotiations completed to either sign that contract or strike. So the chance of strike, I would say, is extremely high. And their offer is extremely high, or their ask is extremely high. So just keep that in mind. Now, I do want to talk about something else before we close up the show today. It's involving rail in Canada. So we've got another negotiation that is going south. This one is closer to the eruption point. So it's really negotiating a deal between Canadian Pacific, Kansas City, Canadian National Railway, and TCRC. So TCRC is the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference. The issue here is as of May 1st, they entered a cooling off period. It's a mandatory 21-day cooling off period. And it is required by Canadian law before the TCRC can strike. But voting took place between April 6th to May 1st, and the vote was tallied this Wednesday, and it really required, they're coming up to a almost 100% likelihood of a strike. Negotiations have just not been working, and they have been working on this contract for a while. So keep that in mind as well. Obviously, a lot going on right now, a lot continuing to go on. We're going to cover more subjects next week. Make sure you reach out to me if there's a topic you're like, hey, Jason, could you cover this for me? We're working on this project, and I just want to know what you guys are thinking on it. I'll also we've got some industry experts coming in here in the next few weeks, so super excited about that. But I really appreciate everybody for joining today. I really appreciate your viewership, and make it a great day, make it a great week, and yeah, obviously have a great weekend as well. Thank you all. Bye.